When Paul wrote to Timothy, according to the New Testament, he asserted that the love of money is the root of all evil. Now, if I were to write to Timothy today, I believe I would try to make the case that the root of the majority of today's problems is the practice of othering. I've talked about this before. Othering is the practice of emphasizing the differences between people into an us group and a them group. Race differences, political differences, economic differences, theological differences, crosstown rivalries, Coke versus Pepsi, Ford versus Chevy. The list is endless. They all serve to divide us into factions, suspicious of one another, and believing the other is not only wrong, but has it out for us. I've talked about this several times before, which has led me to share this passage before. It's by Albert Einstein. A human being is a part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feeling, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Now, in Karen Armstrong's book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, she writes, while he was working toward enlightenment, the Buddha devised a meditation that made him conscious of the positive emotions of friendship, compassion, joy, and even-mindedness that lay dormant in his mind. He then directed this immeasurable love to the ends of the earth. Later, he would tell his monks to do the same. When your mind is filled with love, send it in one direction, then a second, a third, and a fourth, then above, then below. Identify with everything without hatred, resentment, anger, or enmity. This mind of love is very wide. It grows immeasurably and eventually is able to embrace the whole world. Over time, the Buddha found that by constantly activating these positive psychological states, he became free of the constrictions of hostility and fear, and that his own mind expanded with the immeasurable power of love. Einstein called it widening our circle of compassion. The seventh UU principle is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Buddha instructed, when your mind is filled with love, send it in one direction, then a second, a third, and a fourth, then above, then below. The first of the 5 principles of Buddhism is ahimsa, an ancient Indian principle of nonviolence. Similarly, in Hinduism, ahimsa is the principle of the absolute reverence for life, and gave rise to a rapid growth of vegetarianism. It's a multidimensional concept inspired by the premise that all living beings have the spark of divine spiritual energy. So to hurt another being is to hurt oneself. As Indian Hindu sage Ramana Maharshi replied, when asked how we are to treat others, he replied, there are no others. Our world is having enough trouble widening our circle of compassion to include all living people, as Einstein suggested, let alone all living creatures. Once we add animals to the mix and suggest that people lay off the barbecue, it becomes even more fraught with tension. But let me quickly interject here that while I'm advocating for reconsidering our eating habits, I'm not going to presume to tell you what conclusion you should come to. A rule of thumb for my sermons is that instead of providing answers, I prompt you to ask better questions. I can tell you how my experience has informed my decisions and hope that it will spark ideas in you. Most of all, I hope to encourage all of us to be more intentional in considering and arriving at conclusions about what we believe, which I believe is at the heart of our covenantal community. So, I'm not going to insist you incorporate a vegan or vegetarian practice into your life any more than I'm going to insist you incorporate a Buddhist or pagan practice into your life. But I would find it really cool if something I said made you consider them when you might not have otherwise. In fact, that's my goal. So today, I'm giving you some information to consider, which I hope leads you to think about expanding your circle of compassion to include not only all living creatures, but the whole of nature, and how that affects being more intentional and thoughtful about what you eat. So, as I was working on my remarks for this morning, I began reflecting on the similarities between the religion we practice and those things we choose to eat. Preferences for both are formed by where and when we grew up, and the cultures of our families, despite the fact that many people believe they would have arrived at those same choices independent of those considerations. But it's difficult to deny we absorb the cultural and spiritual beliefs that are predominant in our families when and where we grew up. Our early reality is what we hear, see, and experience in our childhood, because that's what those around us are hearing, seeing, and, yes, tasting. One of many people's earliest experiences is being blessed or baptized as a baby. Many continue on in that familiar faith tradition, if not that actual congregation, all their lives. They may get married there, bring their kids to Sunday school there, and continue on until their memorial service. Surprisingly, people's food preferences begin even earlier, before birth. According to the journal Pediatrics, after 21 weeks of conception, a developing baby in the womb begins ingesting the amniotic fluid. This fluid is flavored by the foods and beverages the mother has eaten in the previous few hours. According to Julie Manella, author of the study, this creates memories of these flavors, often resulting in preferences for these foods or odors for a lifetime. I had sometimes wondered why folks in certain cultures were predisposed toward spicy food, for instance. Once the baby is born, they bond with mom while nursing. And by the way, the milk is also flavored by what the mother has eaten recently. A little older, they enjoy eating with family and friends. So you can easily see how the socio-cultural aspects of sharing and togetherness reinforce these food choices. Once formed, people were often adamant that those preferences, formed largely by circumstance, are right and true and shouldn't be questioned, and that those of others are questionable, if not downright bizarre. People can pretty quickly get defensive. Some even point to their own interpretation of Scripture to defend their position. They may cite the passage from Genesis I read earlier, claiming it gives us permission to do whatever we want with the fish, birds, and animals with whom we share the world. But it's clear to me we're being told to take care of the animals. If I put you in charge of my 2 dogs, I'm not telling you to eat them. Especially since the very next verse says, I have provided all kinds of grain and all kinds of fruit for you to eat. But it strikes me that most of us in this room did question and were able to reconsider a very important aspect of our lives, our faith community. We came to believe that another way worked better for us, better intellectually, better spiritually, better for the way we want to live our lives. Because most of us came to Unitarian Universalism despite it not being how we were raised. We are formed by our families and culture, and to rebel against them by choosing a different religion or way of eating sets us apart, makes us an other subject to exclusion, and may imply we believe our families are wrong about some elemental and very important stuff. I had a longtime UU minister tell me that more than once, preparing for a memorial service, she discovered the deceased had come out to gay to their family, but not come out as Unitarian Universalist. I guess there's only so much a family can take. We as UUs are often considered the other. So I can't help but wonder, since we have rethought our attitudes towards spirituality and religion, maybe we are also uniquely suited to rethink what we eat and why. Because there are many reasons to rethink what we eat and why. But then again, I think most aspects of our lives would be better if we approach them more thoughtfully and intentionally. Some people have chosen to have a plant-based diet for some or all of their meals. In Ed Winter's book, This is Vegan Propaganda and Other Lies the Meat Industry Tells You, he describes his decision to become vegan because of the inherent cruelty in the way animals are treated. He was the featured speaker at the talk and Q&A we held last night. Excuse me. The first part of his book goes into detail about the inhumane practices not only the animals being bred for food undergo, but even the poor conditions the dairy cows and chickens laying eggs are subjected to. Besides the cruelty aspect that Ed Winters found so compelling, many people extol the health benefits of not eating anything with a face. It has been shown a well-planned plant-based diet can provide even all the protein one needs. For those who claim all vegans are anemic weaklings, I point to a story I saw just this past Thursday night on the news. It was about a 100-year-old great-grandfather who runs between 5 and 10 miles 3 times a week. He has run 60 marathons and holds 4 world records. He became a vegan decades ago and shows no signs of stopping, either eating or running. While I realize that's anecdotal, what has been studied are the Earth's blue zones. Those are 5 areas where people live exceptionally long lives, and there are comparatively very high numbers of centenarians. One of the things most notable about those living in blue zones is that they eat a diet that is 95% plant-based. You may also have seen on the news about droughts and water shortages. According to an UNESCO report, animal farming accounts for about 1/3 of the world's freshwater consumption, with animal products requiring more water to produce than crop products. Winters reports that the lead author of the most comprehensive analysis on farming and the environment to date has stated, a vegan diet is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth. Not just greenhouse gases, but global acidification, land use, and water use. This is but part of widening our circle of compassion to embrace the whole of nature. But we've become very good at distancing ourselves from having to think about the environmental effects of animal farming and the animals who die to provide the meat we find neatly wrapped at H-E-B. I remember an incident from over 50 years ago. I would go with my dad to buy eggs from a man who kept chickens. I remember it occurring to me that the noisy birds in the pen in front of me had the very same name as a meat dish my mother would often serve. My dad, of course, filled me in on the reason. Later, in 3rd grade, our teacher would read a chapter of Charlotte's Web each day after lunch. It's the story of Wilbur, the livestock pig, and Charlotte, a barn spider, and her efforts to keep her friend from becoming a crunchy snack for Zuckerman. In college, I cheered on the Muppets in the Muppet movie as they avoided the villainous Doc Hopper, who wanted Kermit to be his spokesfrog. In one scene, Doc appears from behind a billboard showing a bucket of Doc Hopper's frog legs. He says, "You got the picture, boy? You see what I mean? Kermit the Frog, symbol of Doc Hopper's French fried frog legs. Isn't that splendid? Just take a look. Kermit replies, all I can see are millions of frogs on tiny crutches. But apparently kids don't hear about Wilbur, Charlotte, or Kermit in school anymore because agricultural literacy is at a depressingly low point. A high percentage of Americans do not have even the most basic understanding of where their food comes from or what happens to get it to them. 75% say they usually buy humane animal products, even though government census data suggests that fewer than 1% of farmed animals live on non-factory farms. I recently saw a post that was shared on social media. The person was commenting on a story titled, "Rains Leave Many Indiana Farmers Well Behind in Planting." The woman commented, well, why is there a need for farmers growing corn and soybeans when most people go to Kroger's or Albertsons to get groceries anyway? An online survey cited in Forbes reports that 16 million people believe chocolate milk comes from brown cows, which is yet another reason I implore all of you to vote. 40% of California fourth graders didn't know that hamburger comes from cows, and of course, French fries and potato chips are the nation's most popular vegetables. I guess using that logic, vodka is a vegetable, which I need to convince my doctor of. Despite Wilbur and Kermit, there is a disconnect between what we buy and eat and where it comes from. If we don't even know where our food comes from, except for H-E-B, Kroger's, or Albertsons, how in the world can we begin making responsible choices? With our busy lives, I think most families don't eat dinner together as often as they once did, let alone talk about where their food comes from, or have a garden in the backyard. I also suspect that grace isn't said before dinner very often. I think if we gave more thought to where our food comes from, we would, at the very least, say a prayer of thanks to the animals who gave their lives to provide us with that meal. So while we're widening our circle of compassion, one of the things we will decide is how wide that circle will be. It may evolve over our lifetime. Some people are vegan, vegetarian, pescatarian, or omnivore for years, then change from one to another for various reasons. I can't say why. But I can say that the more plant-based meals we eat, the better, for a lot of reasons. So I encourage you to carefully consider what you eat and the effects of your decisions. You can start slow. You've probably heard of Meatless Mondays. There are lots of tasty recipes online. I guarantee you're not going to get so weak going a day without meat that you'll faint. At the very least, when offered a vegetarian or vegan meal, don't clutch your pearls and act as though someone asked you to give up your firstborn. I guarantee you're not going to get so weak going one meal without meat that you'll faint. I've read of families nearly coming to blows because a vegan bride and groom insisted on a plant-based reception. Let's chill out, folks. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. I invite you to decide what that looks like for you.